Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of exponential technologies, business innovation, entrepreneurship, thought leadership, enterprise IT security, neuroscience, philosophy, personal development, and more. Welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is Bill Murphy, your host of the Red Zone podcast. So my guest today wrote this article that led me to him, and it's called Cloud Security Secrets Your Cloud Provider Doesn't Want You to Know About. So I thought, well, what are those secrets? And so that led me to read the article published by David Linthicum. And I didn't realize how much of a giant David is in the industry, but he's the Chief Cloud Strategy Officer at Deloitte Consulting. He was named the #1 cloud influencer via a major report by Apollo Research. He's a thought leader, executive, consultant, and author, which I'm going to get to what he's done in that realm. He's been a CTO 5 times for public and private companies, a CEO twice in the last 25 years. So few individuals have reached David's level of achievement, reputation, and leadership. And he's a regular research analyst for Gigamon. He's written for IEEE Computing, Tech Target's Search Cloud, and Search AWS. So he's been on NPR many times. He's published 13 books, and he has 5,000 published articles and spoken at more than 500 conference presentations. So he has a very, very deep and kind of rich history and educating the marketplace about where cloud's going. And as you might imagine, Deloitte is often brought in very large companies to consult. And so what I love is if you know where the big companies are really looking for, if you're in the small to medium enterprise, you can be rest assured that the next, either now or coming in the next 12 to 24 months, that you're going to see the impact of some of the things that are happening. And so I asked him a lot of questions that may apply to you now, but they may not apply now, but they're definitely going to apply 12 months, 24 months down the road. And so it's a great way to look around the corner of what companies are really asking. So we talked about why businesses have a tendency to learn from pain, and now is the time to think independently and question why things are currently being done. And cloud security only improves in a culture that challenges status quo. Another learning element here is there's going to be architectural trade-offs that we have to do that will challenge what we do pragmatically with the technology that's out there. And we talked about how security can hinder performance and cost way more money each month if it's not engineered into applications. We also really talked about when you hire people, you need to hire people who are going to be continuous learners, autodidacts, which is more than leaning into a specific skill sets, leaning into people who have width and that want to be continuous learners. So we get into a lot more than this, but I just wanted to give you just a bit of a teaser of what is in this interview. And so really lean back, take lots of notes. We put links to the show notes for you to read through it if you prefer. If you want to go find him on LinkedIn and read some of his material, he's got a wealth of information that we'll put into the show notes. So with that, I want to welcome you to my conversation with David Linthicum.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. Appreciate you having me on the show.
Well, all of my listeners have just listened to me talk about your extensive and very prolific background, and I'd love for you to talk about the present and what you've just written this, I think, a great article on LinkedIn, Cloud Security Secrets Your Cloud Provider Doesn't Want You to Know. And now that we're all working from home, and now that everybody's really taking advantage of all of the resources that have been built through the years through the cloud, what are your thoughts? What are the secrets some of the providers don't want you to know?
Yeah, that was a blog I did on InfoWorld. Ultimately did that last week. And the big thing is that we're moving into kind of a multi-cloud world. And I think the cloud providers themselves are very interested in their own domain, and so they want to keep security in their own public clouds. And so they offer some very good identity access management encryption systems, directory services, things that are kind of table stakes for moving into security, but typically don't deal with the multi-cloud world. And so when we're moving into a complex, heterogeneous solution, which everybody is moving to right now, whether you're against it or not, ultimately, this is something we have to think through. And so they're not necessarily instructing you on how to work and play well with other clouds. And so the end users are on their own. And so they have to kind of think through what the technical solutions are, what the details are, how to make it happen, how to deal with security managers, what tools are out there, things like that. And I think that's really kind of a tougher nut to crack out there. And I think enterprises are going to end up making mistakes.
And do you think this comes down, when you say multi-cloud, you're beyond just authentication and identity management in multi-cloud? Are you referring more to the back end, having multiple systems and moving them between clouds? Or maybe we can clarify for people what we mean by multi-cloud and what layer?
Yeah, sure. I probably should have stated that first. So multi-cloud is going to be plural public clouds, typically. And it may or may not have a private cloud, which is bolted onto it, which is also a multi-cloud. But if a private cloud is paired with a public cloud, that's called a hybrid cloud, according to NIST. So we're moving to these environments where we're dealing with many traditional systems and applications that are participating and communicating with many systems that are occurring in the public clouds. And those are typically, the big providers, AWS, Microsoft, Google, things like that. And then we have application workloads that are running on those systems. We have data storage that's running on those systems. We have perhaps specialized systems such as AI technology, IoT technology that are running on those systems. And what we're trying to do is come up with a general common security service that goes across all of these systems. At least that's kind of the objective where we're looking to move to going forward. And that's becoming a bit of a difficult thing to do. I think that we're at a point where we're moving into multi-cloud without necessarily the understanding and how to do the proper security and leveraging the right mechanisms. And it's really getting into the mindset that we're going to leverage common services across clouds. And even though people are implementing cloud-native security systems today on the different cloud providers, I don't think that's going to scale. It's going to basically cause too much complexity. We're not going to have people around who are able to maintain all three security systems because it's different skill sets. And that's going to end up raising the vulnerabilities in how these things work.
That is such a big issue that I'm quite vocal about, is stripping complexity out of this. I think that we're at a point where we're well beyond humans. Like, if we don't figure this out now, I think from an architecture perspective, then I don't know if we're going to be able to dig out of the complexity unless we are really thoughtful about the strategy of how we're going to handle this.
Yeah, I'm passionate about it. I mean, one of the things I've done at Deloitte and with a great team here is create a cloud complexity management methodology, an approach to either fix complexity as we find it or avoid complexity as we start moving into the cloud. And I think that it's something that should be on one of the top priorities of the different enterprises out there. And, we're going through this crisis, and I think one of the things that could be a negative outcome is companies moving too quickly to tactical decisions around security and governance, things like that ultimately lead to so much complexity that you can't operationalize the systems. And we saw that in the last year or so. So in other words, enterprises will build these very complex, heterogeneous multi-cloud environments because, that's what the cool kids are doing. And they're rolling it out, and then ultimately they throw it to operations, and operations just doesn't have the resources, the skills, or the tooling to operationalize stuff. And then it gets kicked back to the developers and the migration systems, and they end up normalizing or basically migrating twice to fix problems with complexity. So we can proactively avoid it. However, I'm not a big fan these days of wagging my finger at people who made mistakes, but we can actually fix the thing once it's been deployed and do so with a minimum amount of work.
So we have this moving car, and we're trying to change the tires in a moving car. And potentially there's multiple moving cars if there's multiple clouds. So if I think the authentication, the IAM tools, I guess sort of thinking of RSA, Microsoft, Okta, Duo, and the list goes on. Are you seeing complexity at that side of the fence with some of these decisions?
I am if they're using multiple tools without good reason for using multiple tools. So in many instances, you find out that they're using heterogeneous security managers because something has maybe 5% of the capabilities that they're looking for. To me, that's not a good reason. And so I'd rather see them standardize on one tool and do the custom integrations to put it under one abstraction layer, versus multiple abstraction layers. And I think that's where people run into problems. And of course, even if you have the people around to maintain a very complex environment, I think ultimately you're going to find that it's going to raise the risk of breaches just because of the complexity that's there. And you can calculate that. The cost of risk is something that, consultants have figured out for years and how to do it. And then the more technology you have that layers into the systems, even if it has a specific niche-based role, the more complexity that comes in and the weaker your security system is going to come in. So in other words, you can have one security system that's much better than three security systems, even though that one security system doesn't cover every feature and function that you need. And so people need to consider the trade-offs there. Even staying with traditional security for now in certain instances where you can't incorporate legacy or traditional technology under the security blankets, different ways of dealing with compliance, things like that. And really, we need to consider these trade-offs. We have a tendency to kind of be kids in a candy store. And since cloud computing is almost instantaneous satisfaction, we can go ahead and add these things in a very short period of time. Even some of the on-premises systems, we can download them in a very short period of time. And we need to ask ourselves, it's not that we can, it's really, should we? And I think that's the question that's not being asked.
Well, I think this potential, and again, I think the markets are going to rebound. I know you share that opinion. But I do believe that regardless of whether the markets rebound or not, businesses want speed, and that is speed and defense. I call it offense and defense. The offense desires for the organization are moving, and they're moving fast. And one of the questions is, how do you structure your defense so that it is mobile and can move fast and keep pace? Because I think businesses are going to keep requiring more testing, more innovative approaches. They're going to not want and also because of the potential economic environment, they're going to need to do more with less. So it seems like that hand's going to be forced for security.
Yeah, it is. And I think the biggest advice I would give is put complexity and put volatility into a single domain that you can configure. So you think about it, we're building security systems, and if we do that properly, they should be able to change fairly quickly to adjust to the needs of the organization. If they don't, then they're going to have value for the first 6 months, then cease to have value after that. So I'd rather see us put the time and effort into creating a security domain that deals with volatility and is able to put volatility into a specific domain that we can configure and change, versus these big monolithic systems that are tightly coupled to all the application workloads and all the data workloads and all the systems out there, or whatever level it is. And if we change them, we have to decouple them, and it's 3 or 4 months of different coding and developing to merge them into something else. And that's just too slow. Number one, it's going to cost us more money. What you just stated, we're probably not going to have the budgets, going forward we had for the last 5 years. Number two, we need to move fast if we're going to move into a product line or take advantage of a market movement, things like that. And I think that companies that aren't able to take advantage of that are going to end up, falling by the wayside, which is a shame. We're going to see this thing that I wrote about, a year ago called the brand apocalypse, where the larger brands and the more cumbersome companies that really don't get the ability to leverage technology as a force multiplier and the ability to deal with, kind of a running and gunning environment and the ability to deal with a very agile environment where we're rewarding those kind of behaviors are just going to end up going away. That doesn't mean they're going to go away completely. They're going to get bought by different people. And we're going to see a lot of brands just kind of disappear, which is a shame.
I think one of the challenges that I know a lot of the decision makers I run into are I see them unconsciously facing is when you have different workloads in AWS or Azure and still having legacy systems on-prem, that they think they're fighting 3 different solution sets or potentially 3 different solution sets, or using the cloud's native security to secure them, and instead of using a third party that they can integrate across all 3. And I'm curious, just what are you running into similar situations with Deloitte that the simple decisions are adding complexity when they need to just simplify on one tool that can scale across the whole?
Yeah, ultimately, that's really kind of the crux of the issue out there. And I think going forward, and people, as they deploy things today, they have a tendency to get around certain religious beliefs around the particular cloud provider. And so you get into some of these enterprises, and you have the AWS folks, you have the Google folks, you have the Microsoft folks, and they think everything that's native to their particular cloud of choice is going to be the right solution, including security. And so they end up deploying 3 different security solutions when really we should look at one common solution that goes across the clouds. And that's a tougher road because, number one, you have to have the political will to get into those different groups and sell them on why that needs to occur. And number two, you need to find a mechanism to make that happen. And they're emerging, but they're, kind of few and far between right now. And in some instances, we have to knit together a couple of tools to make that happen. And then number three, you have to figure out some sort of an operational playbook. In other words, how you're going to run this thing in longer term. And that's where people have a tendency to fall down. So if they do build these 3 different security layers and they don't have common directory services, they don't have common abstraction layers in terms of how you're dealing with security, common encryption frameworks, things like that, they roll it out, then ultimately it kind of runs into the operational challenges where they really can't make this thing work in a safe way for a long period of time. In fact, one of the things that I look for within organizations that are making this mistake, I look at their job postings. And if I see cloud ops jobs, lists and lists and lists, I can tell they have a morale problem because they operationalize something that probably wasn't prepared to get operationalized. And the cloud ops folks think they're being set up for failure and they're moving out of the company. And I think that's, that's a shame. I think we need to think long and hard and put the money and the talent and the observation into the common architecture. And we're missing that, I think, largely.
It's interesting that job description. I often find the job descriptions that, and it's funny, you're working with big enterprises. I tend to work with more mid-market and big small, which is, it's funny, they're still pretty big companies, but they're certainly not super small. And it's interesting that the job postings are quite, they're looking for a savant. And I've yet to see a savant exist in this world of cloud because it's by definition, you're not pulling on someone with 30, 40, 50 years experience. Most of them can't afford that type of a talent. And to your point, I don't think that they've really thought through what they want from the outcome. So they ask for everything.
Yeah, and you can't do that. I think ultimately, when you hire people, you need to hire people who are typically going to be continuous learners, autodidacts, which is more important than specific skill sets. And I think that they're few and far between right now, and people who have every skill. So one of the things I recommend that when people hire, whether it's for security, governance, database, whatever, is that they hire people with the ability to move their skills very quickly as things change. I mean, one of the things that, is a big career booster for me is you got to be prepared for the changes coming down the line and be able to self-learn, as you move forward. And so when I hire people with the same sort of a pattern because I can do more with them over time. If someone has an, AWS security certification and I'm going to put them into a security architect role, eventually the AWS security stuff's going to change. We're going to move to different layers. We're going to move to different levels, different clouds, things like that. And if they can't, maneuver with those changes, and then ultimately they're not going to be much good. And I think the enterprises nearly need to think the same way.
So you had written in this article in InfoWorld about training counts more than technology. And are you seeing that people are going to be able to make that jump from on-premise skill sets to cloud skill sets? And then once they're into cloud skill sets, not become so dogmatic about one particular cloud provider that they start crying if they have to go learn something different?
Yeah, I think ultimately the ability for people to understand where this stuff is going, and as we just mentioned, your ability to become, kind of a continuous learner is going to be the most effective thing to do. But the thing is, enterprises need to splurge and provide the availability of training. And so people who want to go take a video course on lynda.com or Cloud Guru or, any other place that they teach this kind of stuff, should have the capability of doing that. And so what I cite in the article is that, it's 1,000 factor for every dollar you spend. So every dollar you spend on cloud training, you remove $1,000 of cost of risk from your system. To me, that's a bargain. That's something that I can make a tangible value. And you can measure that as well. So ultimately, you need to provide people with an opportunity to self-train and you need to provide people with the ability to, in essence, localize the training in what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And you're going to have certain people who are, have different religious beliefs and things like that, what I call a managed by magazine crowd. In other words, they're following the hype. And you need to kind of identify that and make sure you break those behaviors, because those aren't necessarily going to scale, and it's going to lead to making bad decisions. As far as moving people who are dealing with traditional technologies, security on-premise, things like that, and security in the cloud, completely different beast. But I'm finding that pretty much half the people can make the migration. So it used to be thought, well, none of them can. We have to hire new people with new skills and things like that. The reality is that someone who has 30 years experience in IT, and you're moving them into a security architect role, they come with an invaluable knowledge of traditional systems and how to layer security back into those systems. And I think as we're moving into very complex, heterogeneous cloud environments where we have traditional systems and public clouds and private clouds and IoT and edge-based computing, all these sorts of things, those skills are invaluable because they know how to extend security to a mainframe system. And you talk security to someone who's been in the business for the last 10 years has only dealt with cloud, they're just going to think of cloud-based security when really it's holistic within the enterprise. In fact, you're going to have more ability to have value in terms of a security system with traditional systems than you will with cloud systems, because that's where everything's still running. I mean, most companies only have 20 to 30% of their assets in cloud. Well, the rest is running on-premise. Those things need to be secured. Those security systems need to be updated. And by the way, I think we can use common security layers between the cloud and traditional systems. And thinking through that is a very complex array of technology, a very different way of thinking. And so that's typically going to be a team of the traditional players and the new cloud players that make that happen.
Have you seen organizations that are successfully bridging their security from on-prem world into this multi-cloud world? Are there some case studies or some wins, and not like a classic case study, but are you seeing people that have really got this figured out and they have got teams that are managing all of these domains and pulling it together quite nicely?
Few and far between. There's a couple, key examples. Some of the banks that I've worked with over the years have the ability to create common directory services and common identity access management layers, and implementing common security services and common encryption services between traditional systems and the public clouds. They've done that typically through a lot of pain, trial, and error, and spent a lot of money. And typically, the finance organizations have more money to spend on technology than, say, retail and manufacturing, things like that. For the most part, the pattern is this. The pattern is they go ahead and move into cloud. Typically that's 2 to 3 public clouds, and they're using one as a primary. 80% of the stuff runs on one cloud, and 20% of the stuff runs on the other cloud. But they're still supporting the multiple clouds. Don't have any clue as to how to link the existing security in the cloud-based systems with traditional systems. May not even have the resources to make that happen. And that's the big sticking point. So in other words, it's not the fact that they don't have the desire to create common security layers, but in order to create a common security layer, you're going to have to basically invest in some very expensive people and some very expensive technology to really kind of make that happen. And that's where kind of the trouble comes in. You get the budget limitations besides the desire limitations, where in some organizations, they have the money to spend and they go ahead and splurge on making those things happen. It may be a bit of trial and error, but they make it work. So it's a very small percentage of organizations out there that really have security nailed between traditional systems and cloud-based systems. That's going to increase over time, and certainly as the tooling becomes better, it's going to increase over time. But the core limiting factor is not the fact they don't have the desire, it's resources, it's money, it's budgetary limitations.
It was interesting. Just before the corona hit, we had, like everybody, had a series of different events, physical events that we're putting on that for CIOs and CISOs related to, believe it or not, SIEM solutions. But it wasn't, I often come back to, there was 10 million quarter-inch drill bits that were sold in Home Depot last year. But I often say nobody wanted a quarter-inch drill bit. They wanted a quarter-inch hole. And it's like nobody wants these seams, but they want what the outcome is. And the more we dove into this, the massive, really this is like an urge. It seemed to me to be an urge for people to want to simplify. Because in theory, if you had one of these systems, if it worked, meaning if it could ingest all the unfriendly other third parties into it, in theory, that would be a step in the direction of less complexity. We're not there yet. So what are your thoughts on centralized, aggregated sort of systems like that? And what are you seeing?
Well, we need to make architectural trade-offs as to what we can do pragmatically with the technology that's out there. And I believe what you said is true right now. In other words, we don't have every perfect tool to remove us from every bit of complexity within the systems. So I think you architect for it ultimately. And so even if you have to leverage different tooling, you minimize the amount of tooling that you're able to leverage and understand the trade-off of adding additional tooling in terms of the operational cost going forward. And I think that, most organizations have lived through their IT careers with never meeting a tool they didn't like. And people have a tendency to kind of jump right to the technology when they're dealing with architecture. And I think that's the wrong approach. I know it's something that's not popular because people don't find, architecture and planning, kind of a sexy process you're able to go through, and it's kind of drudgery for some people. But ultimately, a bit of planning and a bit of thinking in terms of how these things are going to be done, your ability to, create a logical architecture and then a physical architecture. And the cloud complexity management stuff, what we do is ask people to create domains: cognitive domain, data domain, security domain, governance domain. I think it's 9 domains that we have in the stack. And the idea is to look at this from a logical point of view and look for opportunities to improve. And I don't think you're going to be able to see opportunities to improve if you put limitations on your creativity because you're leveraging tools that have a static way of doing things. So you're getting the core processes, getting the core technology, you're having to adapt to someone's vision of what security needs to be versus you creating a logical understanding of what your security patterns are, whether it's in your traditional systems, cloud systems, or all of them. And I typically ask you to do all of them. And then find out the tools that get closest to solving those requirements. And I think if you're able to do that, it's a much more healthier exercise. You're going to get to an optimal solution that's going to have the least amount of complexity. But it does require that you have to stop and do some planning and do some thinking and do some testing and, create a lab in the organization. In some cases, create a center of excellence, so people can come in and test things and, things like that. And those are investments that enterprises are typically lacking now. And I think they should think differently.
Is there an area where outsourcing would make a lot of companies outsource their taxes, they outsource different elements of finance, and they outsource some payroll processing, things of that nature. Are there certain areas within cloud security and that you see as being just really great opportunities for businesses to leverage third-party expertise?
Yeah, I think SecOps would be something that I would look to leverage third-party expertise, because if you think about it, if you're leveraging a third party, they're really good at security operations because they do it for multiple companies. So it's almost like a practice where you go into a doctor and the doctor has had many different experiences, so they know how to cure the issue, versus, someone who's sitting alone in a room who's operating these systems, that hasn't seen it all. And so, but you have to find the right outsourcer in some of these cases. But SecOps and the ability to kind of make these things scale, I kind of like the idea of the ability to leverage managed service providers or, security operational firms, that are able to probably do a better job than the people within the organization just because they have more experience in different patterns of solutions that they're experienced with over the years. But you have to find a good one. But typically you can do it cheaper than you can if you bring it in-house. And I think that we're going to start looking for these opportunities to, outsource some of this stuff going forward. Now, the downside of that, it's a political nightmare if people are against it, because obviously they think you're dealing with security, this is the keys to the kingdom. We probably shouldn't trust an outside organization. But, the reality is we said that about cloud computing, 10 years ago, and look where we are now. Completely trustworthy. And by the way, security is better in the cloud because more R&D dollars are flowing into cloud-based systems and are flowing into traditional systems now. And ultimately, it's just going to be a much healthier way to do it.
Yeah, I think that was probably an argument for many of business departments through the years with finance and accounting and payroll and lots of different areas, accounts payable and like. I think there's a trust factor that has to be built first. But it seems to me, if businesses, especially coming back from the potential pandemic as they kind of reboot themselves, they're going to be focusing on revenue and customer acquisition and retention, and security is, certainly if you're a bank, it's way high. But, even then there's going to be pressures on the offense more than the defense. So they're going to have to make some decisions about if they want Barry, who's been there for 30 years, they want to train him as a security architect or have him working with the app dev folks to kind of put product out into the field. It's going to be interesting decisions.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be, probably more aggressive and probably self-centered for companies going forward, because they're really primarily concerned with protecting themselves, but also the ability to get some of the costs out of the systems. We're going to find that most organizations that spent heavily on IT over the years probably had the worst experience during the pandemic because they had more systems on premise, they had more systems in data centers, and ended up couldn't get humans to get into the data center for whatever reason, lockdown or quarantine, whatever. And ultimately, the clouds kept chugging along. So anybody that had more of a progressive role and was able to move aggressively into the cloud, not only was able to save money, but reduce their vulnerabilities in situations, stuff like this. Organizations that didn't spend the money in moving forward or didn't take the risk, and ended up getting their ears pinned back. And I think people are going to learn from that. Businesses have a tendency to learn from pain. And so coming out of this, the boards of directors, the investors, and I was, an officer of 3 different public companies at different times in my career. And that's where the pressure comes. They're going to say, how are you going to make this thing resilient? How are you going to leverage whatever technologies and resources, including cloud or whatever, to make sure this doesn't happen again? How are you going to bulletproof our existing systems? And so people are going to move in a much more aggressive direction. And so probably not going to spend a lot of time arguing about the trust factor of moving something to a third party. It's going to be, are they cheaper? Are they better? Are they faster? Then we'll do it. Is this thing workload more productive in the cloud? We're going to ahead and make the move and do it. Different security frameworks. And it's really going to be kind of more of a running, gunning kind of thing. I mean, you say offensive. I think that's probably a great word.
Yeah, I agree with the way you just said that. It's going to be, well, you've been on publicly traded companies and seen that pressure. And so you're talking for someone who's been there. And, we've had these pressure points before, and in 2007 and 8, and we've seen it in 2001, the .com, and it's just people have a different mindset when they're in protection mode. It's just a natural human biological. But it's the irony of this is really very, very interesting, and how we've been spending years protecting against the infections, the viruses, the malware, and we've been doing this on a digital framework and wanting to create systems that are very resilient, and that collapsing of security and business continuity have become almost synonymous. So that pressure has been there on our digital universe, and now we have the biological. And it's funny how the words are shared almost equally between them. So I'm wondering if there's a vision of having a business that has an immune system, that has an immune system response to it, of where sometimes we need to go to the hospital because we need to get manual and patch and recover. But for the most part, it's automated. There's automated response to this. And I'm wondering, how close do you think we are to having something that is automated and mimics our biological response?
Yeah, I think for the most part, the enterprises were caught off guard by this, and they found out that they couldn't have a scale remote workforce at scale. They couldn't do manufacturing the way they could. Their core systems were exposed. Even had some security issues, performance issues that arose from this. Few companies, certainly ones that were started in the last 20 years that may be born in the cloud, much more progressive in leveraging technology, typically have a great remote workforce policy. They put in enough VPN circuits. That's the big thing. People were running out of those like crazy. And can scale and have this really kind of as a BCDR process that's built in, are going to do much better and did much better. The problem is that you have to get people thinking about all these different considerations. And so if someone said, last year we'd be in the middle of a pandemic and, dealing with all the business issues around that, I don't think I would have, believed them, but I do believe in building these things into contingencies. Good news is that if you go at this kind of aggressively and progressively, that you're going to be able to build a resilient business that's able to survive viruses, whether it's digital virus or the biological virus that we have today. But you have to think of all these scenarios in your mind. What if we lose our building and the people have to work remotely? And certainly the initial terrorist attacks in New York City were kind of onto that thing. In other words, they lost access to the World Trade Center, and this is in the first bombing. And, ultimately they had to go home and work, for the first time. That was hard to scale because the internet wasn't that big of a deal back then. But the ability to kind of either think in how you're going to configure your business so it's prepared to deal with that, so you're not changing anything, it's just basically is, and therefore defensive against whatever's going to happen, or your ability to, in essence, be defensive and be able to change the business around the way in which you want to consume the technology. And I think that those are hard questions, and I think that they're going to be asked now, but it's kind of a shame that a lot of the organizations that are really truly going to be damaged to the point of being taken out of the market didn't ask these questions last year.
Well, I just had a couple actually one major question that I wanted, hopefully you could help out with. I know you have this cloud complexity methodology through Deloitte, and you had talked about developing an ops playbook. And I think that's interesting because an ops playbook, and then you talked about common directory structure, common encryption, and common abstraction. What did you mean by common abstraction?
Yeah, what we're doing is, in essence, removing the human beings from dealing directly with the complex systems. And so we're creating probably a better term would be a single pane of glass. We're able to see security parameters, security processes. We're able to define policies. We're able to define and configure different, encryption systems, things like that through a common mechanism. So whether whether it's implemented natively in AWS or Microsoft or Google, it doesn't matter to me. I don't have to understand those native APIs. I'm able to leverage some sort of a dashboard that's able to take care of those on my behalf. So I'm dealing with security the same way with AWS, Google, Microsoft, and even my on-premise systems. And so the ability to do that, gives you a much better view in terms of what security is doing holistically in between the various systems. And typically, applications and data sets and things like that typically span these things. They span different clouds, and certainly they span the on-premise systems. And so if you don't have that view, I think you're missing part of the picture. And if you're missing part of the picture, you're going to end up getting into trouble. And I think that we need to think about how we're going to build these abstraction layers and tools to build these abstraction layers. Right now we have, security managers, which are basically do as abstraction layers. We have cloud management platforms, cloud service brokers. We have things that are kind of emerging tools and technology, certainly AI ops stuff that's emerging right now. And which ones should we use? And if we use more than one, are we able to integrate the views into a single pane of glass or a single tool-based systems? Well, we're probably not there yet, but we do have some tools that are able to do some abstraction. And moving to those layers, I think, are going to be hugely beneficial going forward.
So does that mean that we're going to have to really get good with APIs, being able to pull our data out of specific tools and be able to see this and get really good at ingesting APIs into some type of a single tooling system?
Well, if you get a tool that is doing its job, then you shouldn't have to deal with the APIs. It's dealing with the APIs for you. It's providing the abstraction layer between the different APIs and the common way that you're looking at encryption and identity access management and all these things that are important in security stuff.
Okay. Fascinating. Well, this is great. This is what a great conversation, David. And before we go, I wanted to give so where can people find you and where we covered a lot of ground here today, but I'm going to put on the show notes ways for people to reach out and learn more about your expertise and ways that they can start listening to you related to cloud security.
Yeah, I got lots of stuff out on Deloitte.com, including the On Cloud podcast, which we do about once a week. I'm very proud of that, and it's growing in audience all the time. Also, got many cloud computing courses out on lynda.com, and including the Cloud Complexity Management course, which is 3 hours, but worth it. And also find me on InfoWorld, on the Cloud Blogger there.
And you are also teaching at LSU, you said?
Yeah, I'm doing some of the online courses at LSU, having a great time doing that.
That's fantastic. Fantastic. Well, is there anything that you wanted me to ask you that I haven't and you're dying to get out there, or have we covered everything?
I think we covered everything, at least what we should be covering in one episode, but we can do it again soon. Absolutely.
David, well, I appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your guidance for everybody here, and stay healthy here.
You got it. You too, man.
Thank you. So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.